This episode is part of a series where I take already published memoir and break down what works about it and why, or what doesn't work and why. I found that when I'm teaching my memoir method concepts to writers, they benefit from seeing how these principles play out in memoir that you can find at the bookstore. This month, I am looking at the memoir Ordinary Time by Annie B. Jones, and today is part 2. You are listening to the Memoir Method podcast, the place for writers, readers, and anyone who appreciates the collective power of our stories. In this podcast, we explore the impact of memoir alongside an examination of writing techniques and strategies used in the genre. Whether you are a writer looking for inspiration and guidance or a passionate reader seeking meaningful connections through shared experiences, the Memoir Method podcast is your go-to conversation spot. I'm your host, Charlotte, editor, writer, and the heart behind Charlotte Writes. Let's get started. Last week, in episode 90, we dialed in on the editorial foundation of the essay collection Ordinary Time. And I want to note that when most writers reach out to me, they ask for help with the actual writing. The structure that they've been working with isn't working. They feel like it's slogging or nothing's clicking, but they can't figure out why. And it's okay that you don't know why. That is why there are publishing professionals to help you. But they want to dive straight into the writing and the revising of their manuscript. But any revisions that they work on at that point will just yield the same mess and the same confusion. So that's why when I work with writers, we pause first. We don't go directly into the manuscript, but we nail out the foundation and the purpose of their story, then go into the structure and the actual revisions. So today, as I'm going into the structure and craft behind Ordinary Time, I'm doing so with the foundation of the collection anchoring me as I examine this. So as you're going through your own memoir edits, you will make the most of your time, energy, and even money if you know the what and why behind your story. So let's get back to Ordinary Time. Structure in essay collections is fascinating to me. It's one of my favorite puzzles to figure out as an editor. You have the structure of each individual essay, and then you also have the structure of how you string those essays together. So let's go into the micro structure, so the structure of the individual essays. In Ordinary Time, the essays are relatively short. Annie Jones fits 24 essays into her collection. So while there are a lot of them, they are also short and punchy. The book itself is only 220 pages long. So the number of essays and their length was highly intentional. She wrote this so that it would be really easy to dip in and out, but also wrote them and organized them in a way that you would want to keep coming back for more. With shorter essays, she has to get to the point quickly, which means that she has to be crystal clear on what she wants each essay to say. Something that I noticed and really appreciated as a reader in Ordinary Time is that each essay starts with an anchor of sorts, an object, a person, an event, experience, a place. And I'll get into this later in the episode, but the way that Annie uses concrete details not only keeps the reader focused, it also propels each essay forward and then makes it easier to come back into the collection. This is how she has the conversation. She keeps the ideas grounded in something physical and then uses that to explore an idea or a concept, more of a micro idea that again contributes to the thesis, to the conversation of the collection. And that's one of the things that I love about essay collections is being able to take all these little rabbit trails, all these little threads of a story, of a concept, and put them together in a way where each stands out on its own, but they also all serve the overall conversation. So often in this collection, Annie will take that same physical anchoring, that grounding element at the beginning of the essay, and then pull it back in throughout the words of the essay. She'll bring it back in at the end. She'll use it to keep the ideas grounded. She'll use these concrete facets of her point to amplify what she's trying to say in each essay. And again, each essay is organized to contribute to the overall conversation. And then when we zoom out from the micro element of each individual essay, because you want to know what each essay is saying, but then you get to zoom out and figure out how are these essays talking to each other? Because when you're putting them together, you get to consider the topic, the tone, and even the amount of resolution that the reader experiences. What Annie did in her collection is she organized the essays into different sections. So part 1 is staying friends, part 2 is staying put, part 3 is staying faithful, part 4 is staying grounded, and part 5 is staying you. She uses that organization to not only kind of categorize her essays, but also there's an arc there that takes you from the concept of physically staying put in a place and with the people around you, but then it expands into other ways that you can stay in a place and also leave a place. She goes into relationships, religion, ideologies, and then she lands the plane of the collection with essays about staying you, staying true to your identity, regardless of where you are in the world or how often you move around or where you actually live. She takes these essays, categorizes them, but then organizes them in a way that takes you from a much more physical idea and physical application to one that is more ideological, to one that is more expansive and broad. But she does that in a way that allows the reader to reflect back on themselves and to figure out how these concepts play out in their own lived life. And that's exactly what you want as an essay writer putting essays together. You want to have a resolution, and the essays toward the end of the collection have a much more resolute feel than they do of an exploratory one. When I talk about the tone of the essays, that's part of what I mean is, yes, each essay needs to stand on its own, but the essays in the beginning are going to have much more of a let's continue the conversation feel than the essays at the end. And the essays at the end of this collection do feel like, hey, we're slowing down, we are finishing the point and concluding the conversation that's happening on the actual pages of the memoir. So yes, you want your essays to stand on their own. You also want them to stay in conversation with each other. And you want your reader to be able to experience a natural conclusion of that conversation that is the actual book. I really loved the way that Annie executed that in this collection. So let's go into narrative devices. Narrative devices play out a little bit differently in essay collections. Annie uses a few key ones to keep her essays cohesive and part of the same conversation. One of the elements that stood out a lot to me was characters and how she used them. So there were two primary sets of characters. You have her parents and then her husband. And these characters show up in multiple essays. In essays, you're not going to have massive character development for anyone beyond the author, but you want to choose 2 or 3 maybe primary characters to show up multiple times, because that's going to, again, keep the reader grounded in the collection, keep them coming back, keep giving them something familiar as they dip in and out of the collection. Because in an essay collection, you are going to have readers dip in and dip out, but you want them to keep coming back. And the further they get in the collection, it's going to be easier to re-engage when there is content that they're already familiar with. So she spends the first couple essays kind of introducing a couple different people, but then she brings them back in throughout each essay. And so it's a way for the reader to immediately re-engage with something that's already familiar to them. So as we moved through the essays in ordinary time, Annie didn't have to keep introducing her husband. She didn't have to keep contextualizing him over and over. Eventually she could just say Jordan, maybe sometime my husband Jordan, but we knew who she was talking about. We already had a concept and an idea of what their relationship and dynamic was like because she talked about it in other essays before. So this is a way of bringing the reader into the story and giving them familiarity as the essays progress. You get to know her world more and more, so she doesn't have to re-explain things, but then uses that familiarity as a springboard to explore different ideas and different contexts of the same concept of the conversation that her memoir has. She also uses setting and place. Physical places are a major part of the thesis and concept behind Ordinary Time, which we discussed a bit in the last episode. I mean, the subtitle is Lessons Learned While Staying Put. So the location of Thomasville, Georgia is an essential component of this essay collection. It almost operates as a character. So part of Annie staying put physically has to do with her living in a small town that's less than an hour away from her hometown. She's stayed in the same physical place for most, if not all, of her life. You get a feel for Thomasville and its people throughout the essays. As you move through the collection, each essay brings a new facet of the town to the reader. And by the end, you have a much better feel for this small town that is almost its own character. Instead of spending one essay where she spent all of her word space talking about Thomasville, building it out as a scene in one place. She sprinkles the town in throughout the essays. She shows you something new about this place and its people as the essays progress. She doesn't need to spend a whole essay talking about Thomasville, but she threads it through each essay because Thomasville is where she is. That is physically where she's staying put. And just like with the characters in her collection, she uses Thomasville as a through line, as a point of familiarity for the reader. So again, as we're moving throughout the essays, she can mention Thomasville and not have to explain it the more you get into it. She can pull in new facts about it, new insights about it, new facets about this place, but she doesn't have to re-explain because we are already familiar with it. As you are writing your own essay collection, pick out the elements that can be familiar, that you can dip back into over and over as a way to keep the reader pacing with you and as a way to orient the reader so that you don't have to re-explain, but can use that shared context as a starting point for a different part of the conversation. So setting and place in your memoir, whether you are writing an essay collection or not, is essential to giving the reader a place to physically land and orient themselves and ground themselves in the story. When I'm talking with my writers all the time, I talk about, okay, let's bring in the physicality of it because that is what's going to bring the reader into the experience and keep them mentally and emotionally grounded with you. I want a brief note on the narrative arc of Ordinary Time because narrative arcs show up differently in essay collections than they do in prose memoirs. And they show up more as idea arcs. So again, we're taking a concept of staying put and examining it from several different angles. And so you want to craft those angles as an arc. Each essay has its own arc and story, which is important to name and articulate. And then as you put those essays together, you have an arc of ideas, which is what ultimately keeps the reader coming back and leaves them feeling that resolution by the end. So I loved this essay by Annie Jones, and I am so excited that next Tuesday you'll get to hear a conversation that she and I had about this memoir. It was so much fun to talk to her. We talk about the publishing industry, the ins and outs of essay collections, and what it was like for this bookseller by trade to work with a publishing house editor, and her insights are fascinating. I learned so much. And I cannot wait for you to hear this conversation. So tune in next Tuesday for that. Until then, I will be back in your ears on Friday, and I will see you then. You've just listened to an episode of the Memoir Method podcast. The Memoir Method podcast is presented by Charlotte Wrights. If you liked what you heard, the best way to support the show is to subscribe through your preferred podcast player. And if you're feeling especially inspired, I'd love it if you left a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Leaving a review really does help other readers and writers like yourself find the show. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find me on my website at charlottewrights.co or on Instagram at charlottejanewrights. Thank you for tuning in. I'll see you next time. And remember that you have a story that matters.